If you got a Bible, go ahead and turn with me to Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2. Feel free to stop by the table of contents. If you need help finding it, no worries there. There is a quote by David Foster Wallace, the award-winning novelist, short story writer who passed away a number of years ago. And this particular quote just always struck me as incredibly insightful from a spiritual perspective. And I find it especially interesting given that if you know anything about David Foster Wallace, he didn't really consider himself to be a Christian or even a very spiritual type of person at all. But in this quote, I think he nails not just the problem with us as followers of Jesus, but the problem with humanity in general, the perennial struggle for all of us. So I just want to read this to you. It's a really long quote, but I just find it to be incredibly helpful in its analysis of the human condition. He says, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships," he says. "The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC, that's Jesus referred to by his initials, if you were wondering, JC, or Allah, be it Yahweh, or the Wiccan Mother Goddess, or the Four Noble Truths, or some inviolable set of ethical principles." Remember, he's not a follower of Jesus, so he kind of just heaps all of those in a category together. One of the reasons for choosing one of those types of things, he says, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, for instance, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough of those things. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. Worship power, and you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship intellect and being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. But the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful. Remember, he's not a follower of Jesus, so he doesn't believe in that type of thing. He says it's not that, it's that they're unconscious. They are default settings for us as human beings. What a quote, right? So today I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about all of that, if we can. If you're new to our church, we are approximately a third of the way into this year-long initiative that we've called the Year of the Bible. Basically what's happening, people are still excited about Year of the Bible. That's great. That's good. We're doing this thing called Year of the Bible, where basically what's happening is we're reading through the Bible together, cover to cover, over the course of this year. And then on Sundays, here in our time on Sunday mornings, we talk a little bit about either what we just read or what we're about to read or some of the themes in what we're reading so that we can understand it better. So if you're interested in hopping in with us on all of that, this is your first time here on the Sunday, you don't have to play catch up all the way from Genesis 1. You can just hop in right where we are right now. We've got reading plans that are available out in the lobby for you to take. We've got all this info online. If you're feeling really fancy and want to get the reading plan journal, we've got those available on Amazon for like $15. Feel free to hop in with us in the Year of the Bible. But today, we are wrapping up our third teaching series within the Year of the Bible that we've called God Said What? And basically, this is a series all about all of the violence and war and military conquest that is detailed in books of the Bible like Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. So we've been talking about in this series how to register some of the more difficult aspects of those books of the Bible, but also how to understand them properly in their context, what they do and don't mean, how to apply them to our own life, all of that. But this morning, I would love to wrap things up in this series by talking about one aspect of those stories in the Bible, those parts of the Bible, that is massively important for us to grapple with as followers of Jesus, and that's the issue of worship, and specifically, what types of things we worship. That's what the David Foster Wallace quote was about. That's what Judges chapter 2 hits on. And so before we get there, I just want to set the stage for you a little bit so you can kind of understand what's happening in Judges chapter 2. So throughout the previous book of the Bible, before this one, the book of Joshua, we read about Israel's time under the oversight of a new leader in their midst, whose name was, anybody want to take a stab at it? Joshua. I tried to set you up for success with that one. You did great. You picked up on all the clues. Joshua was the leader of the nation of Israel during the book of Joshua. But at the end of his era of leadership, so to speak, Joshua sort of gives this final address to the Israelites before he dies. And there's this moment that you'll actually read about this coming week in the reading plan, where Joshua charges the Israelites to basically decide who and what they're going to worship, the God of Israel or the other gods of the nations around them. And that's where we get this famous line. If you grew up around church, you probably heard this passage before, where Joshua says to the Israelites, quote, "Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But," and here's the next famous part that gets framed on like Christian art that they sell at Hobby Lobby. "As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." So there's this big moment at the end of Joshua's life where he says to the Israelites all of these things, and they commit themselves to it. There's this basically covenant renewal ceremony where the Israelites commit to only ever serving the God of Israel and not worshiping other gods ever. And it's this amazing, awe-inspiring sort of moment, and you're thinking to yourself, this is where the Israelites finally get their stuff together. It's going to be awesome. They're going to worship the right God. And then we read this in Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 10. "After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, after they died, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord or what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals, that is, the gods of the nations around them that they swore they would never worship. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them up out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various other gods of the peoples around them." Again, the precise thing that the previous generation of Israelites swore they would never do. "They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreth," that was another type of goddess worshipped in the land of Canaan. "In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, who they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress." So if you've been following the storyline of the Bible the past month or so, you may pick up on the significance of those last couple verses that we just read. So God had been leading the Israelites into battle after battle. He had been granting them victory after victory over their enemies. But here, when the Israelites begin to worship other gods, they no longer experience that military victory. Quite the opposite, in fact. God allows them to be defeated, plundered, captured by their enemies as a result of all of this. And I think while that might sound a little bit extreme to us to read about, I do want you to think about it in the context of the story so far. So one of the reasons that God allowed the Israelites to defeat these other nations around them and drive them out, you'll remember, was because of the wickedness of these other nations. It was because of how depraved and how warped and how broken these other nations were. So God allowed them to be defeated and driven out of the land by the Israelites. But given that context, the message here in Judges chapter 2 to the Israelites would have been unmistakable. God was saying to them, hey, because you've become like the Canaanites, you are now being treated like the Canaanites were treated. So we can call God's actions harsh here if we want to, but the truth is that his actions here are overwhelmingly consistent with the rest of the Bible. It's overwhelmingly consistent in the story itself. His response to the Israelites' sin is strikingly similar to his response to the Canaanites' sin. His response to the Israelites' idolatry is strikingly similar to his response to the Canaanites' idolatry. He allows the Israelites to also be defeated and driven out of the land as a result of their sin. So I think sometimes people will read these parts of the Bible like this, and they'll feel like God is like playing favorites with the nation of Israel, that he's giving them sort of special treatment. And I definitely understand why it can seem that way at times, why it can read that way. But at the same time, there's also quite a few places like this where God makes it very, very clear. If Israel goes the way of the other nations around them, they will suffer the exact same consequences as the nations around them. But at the center of all of this, I think, is this issue of worship that we're talking about. Specifically, the issue of the Israelites continuously, repeatedly choosing not to worship God and choosing instead to worship other gods, the gods of the nations around them. So if you'll remember, this is why God previously used such strong language for what Israel was to do to anything involved in idol worship in the land of Canaan, saying, if you remember this from a few weeks ago, break down their altars, that is, their altars to other gods, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. That is how passionate, how emphatic God was about them not worshiping other gods in the nation of Israel. And why was God so emphatic about all of that? Well, to borrow a phrase from David Foster Wallace, it's because anything else they were to worship would eat them alive. Remember, those other gods that the Canaanites worshiped, we talked about, they demanded some pretty incredibly destructive stuff from the Canaanites. Things like child sacrifice, some really harmful and abusive sexual practices, among other things. So some people will read passages like this about God telling his people not to worship other gods, and they'll think that God comes across as sort of petty and jealous for saying that. But the truth is that God is trying to keep his people from being eaten alive, consumed quite literally by the worship of other gods. So this isn't petty jealousy on behalf of God. It's wisdom and compassion and concern for his people. So as followers of Jesus, we often talk about the forgiving, compassionate love of God, right? We talk a lot about that, how the love of God inspires him to regularly forgive us of our sins and show us compassion and welcome us in. And that's an absolutely beautiful aspect of God's love. We should talk about that a lot as followers of Jesus. But sometimes I've found that we don't talk nearly enough about the protective love of God. The protective love of God. The idea that God, from a place of love and concern and compassion for his people, says regularly to his people, stay as far away as you can from things like this. Don't go anywhere near that because it will destroy your life if you do. That posture of God may not read as immediately as love to us, but it absolutely is love. It is a ferocious, protective type of love that we see in those passages. So if I say to one of my kids, stay as far away as you can from the busy road in front of our house, it's love for my kids driving me to say that, right? It's concern for their life and their safety and their well-being that is making me say that. If I say to my kids, hey, don't go anywhere near the knife block in our kitchen where all the sharp knives are, that's love for them making me say that to them. It's precisely because I care about them that I give them that warning. And in these passages, I think it's helpful to remember, love does forgive and reconcile and believe, but love also protects. And in these passages, I think that's exactly what we're reading about, is we're reading about the protective love of God for his people. We're reading about how he refuses to be content with his people worshiping other gods because he knows those gods only want to destroy his people. All of God's instructions to the Israelites around idolatry was extreme, intense sort of language. Break their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their idols in the fire. That's extreme and intense language, to be sure. But it was extreme and intense for a very specific reason. God wanted to communicate that these other gods were not to be trifled with. They weren't to be accommodated or cozied up to by the Israelites. They were to be destroyed, avoided entirely. God wanted his people as far away from the knife block as possible. That's how destructive and dangerous worship of these gods were. And although it looks slightly different for us today, I think the same thing is true when it comes to us and our worship of other gods. So as David Foster Wallace said earlier, everybody worships, as in everybody, every human to ever live. People in our society today might not be setting up altars and Asherah poles and bowing down to physical idols in their life, but that doesn't mean at all that they're not worshiping other gods. It just means they're worshiping them in a different way. And sometimes I think you and I, as followers of Jesus, as God's people, can be guilty of joining our society in their worship of other gods, just like the Israelites were guilty of in their day. So my question, my sort of practical question for us this morning is, what does it look like for us today to be aware of that and wary of it? What does it look like for us to be on guard against idolatry in our day, just like the Israelites were called to be on guard against idolatry in theirs? I think we are given at least 3 instructions in the scriptures that help us resist the pull towards idolatry in our day, in our time. First, we're called to flee idolatry. Second, we're called to challenge idolatry. And third, we're called not to leave room for idolatry. Flee idolatry, challenge idolatry, not leave room for it. So let's take each of those in turn. Let's drill down deeper into what they mean, where they come from in the scriptures. So first, let's talk about what it means to flee idolatry. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it just says, point blank, therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. Doesn't get any more obvious than that, any more clear than that. Flee from idolatry. And you know, it's really interesting. That word flee in the original Greek language, it means flee. As in, get as far away from something as fast as you can. That's what the word means. It actually can be translated to escape because it implies a sense of urgency due to a threat or a danger that you are facing. So here's the idea. Even though our approach to idolatry today could look slightly different in practice than what we see in the Old Testament, we're called to flee instead of demolish. The core principle behind it is actually the exact same. Namely, that idolatry is unbelievably destructive and dangerous, so don't go anywhere near it. That's still the idea in the New Testament. So God, in both the Old Testament and the New, does not say to his people, hey, go check out the idol situation and see what you think about it. He doesn't say, go study the idols very, very carefully to decide whether or not you might want to worship them. He doesn't say, get as close as you can to idol worship without actually worshiping idols. He says, flee idolatry. But unfortunately, here's what I've noticed about a lot of followers of Jesus today. Sometimes it would seem that we don't take the New Testament at its word on this. I have found that far too often we end up flirting with idolatry instead of fleeing from it. I think this is most obvious when it comes to our relationship with sex and sexual expression and sexual desire. So the biblical teaching is that any sexual contact with a person you are not married to is sinful, and therefore we could say is an expression of idolatry as a result. And yet, instead of fleeing that idolatry, which 1 Corinthians 6 actually says explicitly, flee sexual immorality, it seems like a lot of us are convinced that we should get as close as possible to sexual sin without actually committing the sin. I see this play out often in a number of different ways. I'll give you a few examples. It'll be uncomfortable because this is a sacred cow in our society, but I'm okay with it. So some TV shows that we watch today, actually a lot of them, regularly contain scene after scene after scene of not just sex, but graphic, explicit sex. And many of us, as followers of Jesus, seem to see no issue whatsoever watching those shows on a regular basis. Some of us are convinced that we can hang out in our apartment alone with our boyfriend or girlfriend for hours on end, and then we are shocked when we go further with our boyfriend or girlfriend physically than we intended to go. The number of conversations that I have had with couples who are engaged, who will tell me with a straight face that they are living in the same house together before being married, and that they don't think they're even at risk of messing up sexually with each other, to be honest, is shocking to me. One time I laughed when a couple told me that. Did not go well, but I laughed out loud when they told me that. So, friends, with all the protective love in my heart for you, I just need to say, none of those situations that I just listed could even be remotely considered fleeing sexual immorality. And you can call me a legalist, you can call me old-fashioned, you can say I'm a prude, you can say that I'm shaming people, hurl whatever insult or pushback you want to hurl at me. But the reality is, I am calling all of us, myself included, to obedience to what the scriptures clearly teach. Clearly teach. And I fully understand that if you're here this morning and you're a non-believer, I realize that that level of obedience, that level of detail probably sounds ridiculous to you, like absolutely ludicrous. But I will tell you, there is all kinds of evidence out there that is showing that our society's current casual, lackadaisical approach to sexual ethics is not actually helping anybody. It isn't serving us well. It isn't serving women specifically well. And it's leaving an unbelievable wake of destruction behind it. People that want nothing to do with Jesus are observing that this is what is happening in the wake of the sexual revolution. So maybe that is why Jesus and the biblical authors prescribe such an extreme approach towards sexual immorality, towards sexual idolatry. Because they know that idolatry is destructive. They know that it will eat people alive. And so the scriptures teach we are to flee idolatry. But it's not just sexual idolatry that we're called to flee from. It's also the idolatry of power, for instance. The idolatry of money and material things. The idolatry of self-fulfillment and self-actualization. The idolatry of beauty and appearance in your own body, like David Foster Wallace mentioned. It's the idolatry of work and busyness and career. It can even be the idolatry of our kids and structuring our entire lives and life rhythms around our kids to the point that we have no time for other things that matter. It's the idolatry of marriage and doing whatever it takes to find someone to marry, regardless of how unhealthy those behaviors are. The list goes on and on. One theologian famously said back in the day that we as human beings are idol factories. We are constantly manufacturing new things to worship and new ways to worship them. But whatever it is and however it is that we are prone to worship idols, that we are given towards idolatry, the scriptures are crystal clear. We are to flee idolatry. Get as far as you can away from it. If you are asking, how close can I get to idolatry without it being idolatry, you've already lost. Flee idolatry is what the scriptures teach. Second, we are also called to challenge idolatry. To challenge idolatry. So to be a little more descriptive here, what I mean is we are to challenge the promises that idolatry often makes to us. So I want to read a passage to you that I'm sure a lot of us have actually heard before, or at least heard parts of it, but I want to encourage you to think about it in a slightly new way with me in light of what Paul meant by it. So this is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 4. It says, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, the weapons we fight with," he says, "have divine power to demolish strongholds." So we demolish, notice that strong language there, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So generally speaking, I hear that last verse quoted often by Christians in regards to taking captive any internal thought that we might have that's sinful or impure. So if I have a lustful thought, I should take that thought captive. If I'm experiencing bitterness or resentful thoughts, I should take those thoughts captive in my mind, things like that. And while I certainly think that is included in what Paul is saying here. I'll also add that that's not really the focal point of what he's trying to get across in this passage. So that word demolish at the beginning of 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4, is the word often used to describe physically taking something down. So it's actually really close to the Old Testament word used for tearing down altars to other gods. Demolish the altars, take them down. And then the word pretension in 2 Corinthians is most literally translated high thing or high place, something that is elevated, in other words. So in the Old Testament, and even in Paul's day, places where idols were worshiped were called high places. You see that all through the Old Testament. The place where an idol was worshiped was called a high place. So here's my point. I don't think Paul using any of that language in 2 Corinthians 10 is a coincidence. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. I think he's referring to a very specific thing. Paul was steeped in the story of the Old Testament. What Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians is that you and I are called to tear down the high places. That we are called to tear down the things that are elevated as idols in our day and age. We too are called to tear down those idolatries. But by using the words arguments and thoughts here, I think Paul is implying that today, idolatries often come in the form of ideas or ideologies. We did a whole sermon on this back in our City on a Hill series a while back. But idolatry often comes in the form of ideologies or thoughts, or we might even use a word like worldviews. That's the form that idolatry often comes in today. So often, for followers of Jesus, a fight against idolatry comes in the form of challenging certain ideas and the assumptions underneath them. So it looks like holding the promises of idolatry up against reality, and specifically biblical reality, and calling out the lies that idolatry tells. So here's the truth. Often, idolatry doesn't actually make much sense. Doesn't make much rational sense. Idolatry often invites you and I into some pretty crazy things, pretty crazy behaviors. It demands all or most of our time, effort, energy, money, resources. And then as a result, it doesn't deliver us anywhere near what it promises to deliver. And so I think what Paul is saying here in 2 Corinthians is this: call idolatry's bluff on that. Just call it on its BS, which stands for bluff stuff, obviously. I don't know what else you guys would have thought it meant. But call idolatry's bluff, right? Take a step back in the moment and ask the question, is what I'm worshiping actually delivering what it's promising me? Is it actually providing me with the fullness of life that I'm continually running to this idol for? Is it truly worth the time, the effort, the energy, the money, the resources that I'm always giving over to it? Is it worth all of that? And if we're completely honest and even remotely objective about the answer to that question, the answer is no. It's not worth it. It's not delivering what it promises. So let me just give you a few examples, if I can. Being occasionally admired by your colleagues at work is not actually worth not having a life at all outside of work. It's not actually worth it. Getting a date is not actually worth changing your entire personality to have to pretend you're somebody other than you are. That meaningless hookup is not actually worth the shame, the regret, the awkwardness, the complications that you feel as a result of it. That new car that you think will fix your life is not worth the financial hole that it will put you and your family in as a result of buying it. Adding another kid to try and fix your marriage is not actually worth the additional strain that it will put on your marriage. The lie of idolatry, the only power that idolatry has over you, is in convincing you that it will one day deliver what it has never delivered before. That's the trick. So here's the lie. Just keep chasing it, idolatry says. Just keep pursuing it. Just keep giving all your time, all your energy, all your money, all your effort towards this thing. One day you'll wake up and it will deliver you the one thing that it's never delivered you before. That's the one play idolatry has. And it is quite literally a lie from hell. So Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, hey, what if we were to call that lie out? What if we were to challenge the promises that idolatry makes? What if we just said, via the power of the Holy Spirit within us, that's not true, and I will not live as if it is? I think if we took the time to do that in regards to the things that we are prone to worship, we might just discover what Paul says in verse 4 is true, which is that through Jesus, we have divine power to demolish strongholds in our life. Follower of Jesus, if you have the Holy Spirit within you, you have been granted divine power to demolish strongholds in your life. And I'm just crazy enough to think that the scriptures mean it when they say that. Final thing I'll give you this morning is don't leave room for idolatry in your life. Don't leave room for idolatry. The best way to avoid being vulnerable to idolatry is to not leave room for it in the first place to take root. For this, I want you to take a look with me at Jeremiah chapter 2. I want you to listen in this passage to how God sort of narrates the problem of idolatry. He says this, "My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, God, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." So here's the problem. When you forsake the true God, you will go looking for other gods. Put even more plainly, when you create a vacuum in your life and heart in regards to what you worship, something is always going to step in to fill that vacuum. Every time. As we've already said this morning, we are idol factories. Everybody worships. So when we are not consistently worshiping the real, true God, we will inevitably go on the hunt for substitutes. And the substitutes that we find are always worse than the real thing. Every time. So here's my point. In light of that, what if we reverse engineered that whole thing? If the reason that we always go looking for idols is because we aren't being satisfied with the true God, would it not stand to reason that the more we worship, love, serve, and are satisfied with the true God, the less we will be inclined to go hunting for idols? Sure does make sense to me. So here's the offer we're given in the scriptures. I want you to hear this. This is so important that you know. The offer we are given in the scriptures from the God of the universe is this. Come find all you need, all you want, all you desire in him. Come find in Jesus someone who always delivers what he promises, who always fulfills, always satisfies, who never disappoints. Come and find something more lasting, more satisfying, more full of life than anything this world has on offer ever. Experience what it feels like as a result to not continuously need the next thing, the next fix, the next experience, the next relationship, the next upgrade in your life, because none of that even compares to what you have in Jesus. That is the message of the scriptures. And for those of us like me that have chased thing after thing after thing that has left us wanting, both before we started following Jesus and now as a follower of Jesus, for those of us that have found ourselves chasing those sorts of things, here's the offer, here's the invitation. I'm just going to read it to you straight from Isaiah 55, one of my favorite passages in all the Old Testament. It says, God says to his people, "Come, all of you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat." Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money? Listen to this question. Why spend money on what is not bread? Why spend your labor on what doesn't satisfy? Listen to me, God says, and eat what is good. And you will delight in the richest of fare. Why spend money on something that won't satisfy you? Why labor for something that will not last? Instead, we should eat what is good, labor for what lasts, drink from the well that never runs out. And by doing that each and every day as we learn to follow Jesus, I think we gain the ability to crowd idolatry out of our lives over time. Listen, what we do here on Sunday mornings, it's important, not least, because what we are doing here is preemptively crowding idolatry out of our lives. You realize that, right? That's what we're doing here. What you do in your life group settings each and every week is actually idolatry prevention. It's idolatry defense. What you are doing when you read through the scriptures, when you spend time in prayer before the Father, what you are doing is that you are making idolatry look less and less desirable in your life by comparison. That's what it means to follow Jesus. It looks like continuously filling your life with the good news of Jesus and all of its implications and all of its blessings, such that over time, as a result, idolatry starts to look weak and uninteresting by comparison to all of that. Because it doesn't offer what God offers. It doesn't deliver what Jesus can deliver. And listen, none of this happens instantly or instantaneously. That's not how following Jesus works. But it does absolutely happen gradually, over time, as we choose to worship the true and living God. So each week, what we do is that we go to the tables all around this room and we participate in one very tangible reminder of everything I just talked about. We quite literally eat and drink as a way of saying that what Jesus accomplished on the cross for us is all that we need. As a way of reminding ourselves that this bread always satisfies, that this drink always quenches our thirst. And because we have this, we don't need all the other stuff that'll never deliver what it promises. Idolatry does not have to eat you alive, not when you have access to Jesus. Not when you have divine power to demolish strongholds in your life. Not when you have the fountain of living water available to you. So my prayer is that we realize that more and more together as we follow Jesus. That's the task before us. Let me pray for us to that end.